We're grateful to be able to start Sunday school again here at New Presbyterian Church, and we continue now with a series that I made several years ago called Lord of All. It's based on a book I co-wrote with Dr. D. James Kennedy by the same title. It shows the point that Jesus Christ is Lord over every sphere of human existence. Welcome back to our series on finding God's purpose for our lives. In this session, we'll be talking about what we called in the book the sphere of the state. That includes politics. Does Christianity have anything to say about politics and government? Many preachers today are unwilling to say anything of a political nature, even when dealing with moral questions that in today's culture have become politicized, whether we like it or not. Because some moral issues now have political implications, are we therefore to avoid them in the pulpit? Meanwhile, whole generations of Americans have grown up without the slightest idea that the Bible has anything to say related to government or politics. Some people today even think that the church has no business saying anything about government. We ask some everyday people on this issue, do Christians and politics mix?
Christians and politics are certainly mixing in this era.
I think that religion and politics are two different ways people try to develop and express the best of themselves.
Do religion and politics mix? Well, I guess that would depend on the politician. Some of them think they're God. I don't know if that counts as mixing with religion.
There were a lot of Christians that were the founding fathers of our nation. But it's now where there are a lot of politicians that are dictating religious legislation, and then there are Christians that are making political stands that maybe are not necessarily part of their faith.
If we're not raising up righteous leaders, and if the church isn't involved in that process, we have a real concern.
So there's a distinction between the true Christian and the true politician, which is the norm. But you do have exceptions where you do have politicians who are Christians and Christians who dabble in politics.
In my perspective, I do believe that Christianity is an important factor in politics or government because as the United States is a nation based on Christianity, founded by Christian founding fathers, we should continue in that lead and take our history and continue forth with it and not lose it.
For a long time, there's been a common perception among Christians that politics and religion don't mix. Perhaps this is an outgrowth of politicians abusing Christianity for their own purposes. Or perhaps this is an outgrowth of trying to avoid what I call the medieval mistake, that is, using the sword to try to enforce Christian doctrine. Mistaken Christians have used the sword to punish heretics in times past, and this has brought nothing but dishonor to Christ. How many times are we confronted about the Crusades, which ended officially some 700 years ago, or the Inquisition, which ended officially about 500 years ago? But how about now? Are we as Christians to be involved in politics in any way? Well, the founders of America certainly believed so, and the vast majority of them were professing Christians. I like the way the 30th President Calvin Coolidge once put it, if good men don't hold office, bad men will. And of course, Edmund Burke famously said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And yet, we're being told today repeatedly that religion and politics must be completely separate. Look at this classic scene from a movie about politics.
Mr. Chairman, I stand for the separation of church and state, and the reason that I stand for that is the same reason that I believe our forefathers did. It is not there to protect religion from the grasp of government, but to protect our government from the grasp of religious fanaticism.
Unfortunately, that sentiment is popular among many today. George Washington once reportedly said, "Government is a dangerous servant and a fearful master." Contrary to what the character said in the movie scene we just saw, the founders of this country were imbued with a biblical concept of government. Even those who didn't personally know Jesus Christ had that biblical worldview. The pulpits of colonial America, particularly those of New England, had sermons applying the Word of God to everything, including politics. Pastors routinely had election day sermons. Did you know that even the word election, as applied to politics, comes from the biblical teaching of election? The goal in elections was for the citizens to decide which of these two candidates did the voters think was the more likely to be the elect of God. The first great American historian, George Bancroft, said that the first time a ballot was ever cast in America was for the minister in a Puritan town in 1628. But in recent generations, many pulpits are silent about anything related to politics. In addition, many citizens of this country have acted and voted in an unbiblical way. That is to say, they may profess to believe in the Bible, yet they vote for candidates whose words or deeds undermine biblical morality. Here are some thoughts from theologian Dr. Wayne Grudem, who spent a lot of time researching and writing his massive book, Politics According to the Bible.
I think that Christians have a biblical responsibility to seek to influence government for good. Significant influence is not compelling religion. It's not trying to force anyone to accept our viewpoints. It's simply trying to persuade, trying to speak in the public square and say, don't these views and these policies seem best for the good of the nation? I think that when we seek to influence government for good, we're loving God because we're seeking that government would implement laws that reflect God's moral character. The Bible does tell us that God will hold us accountable for how we act. I think that includes all of life, and certainly it includes how we have acted in responsibility toward influencing government.
Dr. Kennedy once pointed out that the ultimate source of all authority is not the state. It's not even the people. It is God. Whatever power man exercises, he exercises it merely as a delegated power and authority from God. And the state is answerable to God. The state then is an agency of God's common grace, not His special grace, which deals with our salvation. Through the state, God restrains wickedness. Now, contrary to the de facto view of some politicians today, the state is not God. The state is obviously limited in its authority and power because God has placed a limit. The state does not encompass all things. There are other spheres. There's the sphere of the family. There's the sphere of the church. There's the sphere of the school and of science that the state is not to control, as we see that it endeavors to do in totalitarian states. Now, there are rare occasions where the state forbids us to obey God. For example, by making it a crime to tell others about Jesus. In such cases, the Christian is bound to obey God rather than men because the state is limited in its authority. In Oslo, Norway is my favorite museum in the world, and that's saying a lot because I like museums. This particular museum is dedicated to those brave Norwegians who fought under the radar against the Nazis who took over that country from 1940 to 1945. In fact, the Nazis took over everything, including the schools and the churches. You can see in that museum, the Resistance Museum, where the Nazis actually taught the children to learn Romans 13, to obey the state, for it is ordained by God. Here were the Nazis using the Bible for Nazi propaganda. Talk about the devil quoting Scripture. That's an abuse of the sphere of the state, as was the whole Nazi tyranny. Everywhere it existed, it was an abuse of the sphere of the state. In fact, in one meeting in Germany, in the early days of the Nazi movement, a courageous pastor spoke up, and Hitler said to him, "You in the church look after the souls of your people, but I'll look after the nation and the politics." And Hitler did. And what a disaster it was for everyone. Political leaders should be a blessing to the people, not a curse. One Christian politician who stands out, in fact, he's a statesman really, is William Wilberforce. He led a lifelong crusade against slavery because he was motivated by the love of Jesus. Let's take a closer look.
Although virtually unknown today, William Wilberforce, longtime member of the British Parliament from 1780 to 1825, was perhaps the greatest Christian statesman of all time.
When Wilberforce died, he was described as the George Washington of humanity.
Christian author and thinker Os Guinness comments on Wilberforce before his conversion.
He grew up in a wealthy family. He went to Cambridge, where he spent most of his time basically idling and gambling and drinking.
Upon leaving Cambridge, Wilberforce ran for Parliament at the age of 21. Because he was such an excellent speaker, he won, and he ended up serving as a member of Parliament in the House of Commons for the next 45 years.
He was not a Christian when he ran for Parliament in 1780. He was actuated by, as he said, motives of ambition. Distinction was my darling object, he said. He wanted to make a name for himself.
Historian Kevin Belmonte is the author of Hero for Humanity.
We do know, although he never had any dalliances with the ladies, that it was not unusual for him to sip tea in a brothel. So Wilberforce was not a person of high moral character at this point in his life.
But all of that was to change about 4 years later when Wilberforce committed his life to Jesus. As a Christian in Parliament, he was then challenged to deal with the horrific issue of slavery in the British Empire.
He then began to find out in great detail the horrific conditions that existed with the slave trade and with slavery itself as existed in the West Indies. Wilberforce became convinced, as so many did, that something needed to be done about this.
Soon, Wilberforce formed the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. The group came to be called the Clapham Circle because of the town just outside London where they frequently met. They studied the slave trade intensively and thoroughly.
The best estimates we have about the number of people who were enslaved in Africa and carried to the New World, some 11 million people who were enslaved.
In 1789, Wilberforce gave a lengthy speech in Parliament for abolishing the wicked practice.
So he stood up on the floor of the Parliament, influenced by his new Christian conviction, and took a stand that was enormously unpopular because all of the vested interests in Britain opposed him, including the government. And for 20 years he waged that battle.
The late Chuck Colson, prison reformer who's been deeply inspired by Wilberforce.
The British government was making £500 million sterling per year, taking black bodies and putting them in the holds of ships and carrying them to the Western Hemisphere and selling them.
He would make these speeches that lasted for hours, marshaling an impassioned plea, graphic evidence about how slaves would be murdered aboard ship, or the abuses one might find when the slaves reached the New World.
He was attacked physically, he was attacked verbally, he was slandered, reviled, insulted. He was the most vilified man in the world at one stage.
He kept fighting the good fight, despite the kinds of opposition that he incurred, despite the threats to his life, the physical assault he suffered, despite a challenge to a duel from a West Indian slave-owning captain. Wilberforce soldiered on.
Finally, the efforts of Wilberforce and his Clapham colleagues succeeded in banning the slave trade.
One day in 1807, in a February snowstorm, the votes were cast to abolish the slave trade. And while members of Parliament were jumping up and down for joy, they looked over and there was Wilberforce, head bowed at his desk, praying, thanking God for what he had done.
But Wilberforce wasn't finished. He not only set out to end the slave trade, but also to emancipate the slaves, who even after this vote were still in chains throughout the British Empire. This was a battle to last for another 25 years. When he was virtually on his deathbed in 1833, he received word that the Parliament decided to free all of the 700,000 slaves throughout the British Empire.
The man gave his entire life to the abolition of slavery.
William Wilberforce is the greatest reformer in all history and a follower of Jesus Christ. And he did it for Jesus Christ, and everything was rooted in his faith and his theological understanding.
When William Wilberforce became converted about the age of 25, he wondered, after having been in Parliament for about 4 years at the time, now that I'm a Christian, should I remain in politics? Can God use me in that way? Shouldn't I go into the ministry full-time instead? He wondered if that's what God wanted him to do. So he met with the Reverend John Newton. Now, John Newton was not your ordinary minister at that time in England. He was a former slave trader. John Newton became saved out of all that and wrote the famous hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. He was a wretch, and God, through Christ, had saved him. So, Wilberforce's question to Reverend Newton was, to really serve God, should I now get out of politics? And Newton's answer was essentially, well, maybe God can use you where you are. John Newton said, the Lord has raised you up to the good of His church and for the good of the nation. Could you imagine if some of our modern ministers had counseled Wilberforce? Why are you wasting your time in politics? Nothing good can come from that. Well, hindsight is always 20/20. We can see what a travesty that would have been if Wilberforce didn't realize, through John Newton's help, that he could faithfully serve the Lord while remaining in politics. World history could have turned out differently and much for the worse. Thus, we should encourage those Christians who feel led to get involved in politics for the biblical motive of doing the most good. Here's Pastor Rick Scarborough, who spends a lot of his time encouraging Christians to get involved in the political process.
The future of America will be determined by the church. If Christians turn out in large numbers, larger numbers than they have in the past, then God-fearing candidates all up and down the line, not just president, but all the way down to local school boards, will be elected to office and will begin reshaping and redirecting this culture. But if Christians stay home, as they often do, and do nothing, wring their hands and ask questions like, well, how could they let this happen? I believe eternity will reveal that the judgment hand of God will have fallen upon this nation and this culture, not because ungodly men and women were elected, but because the church was silent.
One of the great blessings of the Christian view of politics relates to our basic view of man. For example, in the American experience, the Founding Fathers believed the witness of the Bible, of Christian political philosophers like John Locke and Baron Montesquieu, and of all of human history, that basically human beings are sinful. Therefore, power should be divided so that no one man or small group of people could grab too much power and lord it over others. This view of the sinfulness of man, when harnessed in the political realm, has led to enormous freedom. Now, in contrast, as an example, Karl Marx, the father of the communists, assumed that man was basically good and that when the workers, that is the proletariat, seized power, they would supposedly usher in the workers' paradise and then government would no longer be needed. So it would just wither away. How naive. In reality, that unbiblical view unleashed unbelievable horrors under Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, and Fidel Castro and others. Whether they like it or not, this world needs the influence of the Bible and of godly men and women, even in the realm of politics. Here's the late Dr. D. James Kennedy with a quick anecdote on Christians and politics.
I remember 20 years ago, a Christian said to me, "You don't really believe that Christians should get active in politics, do you?" And I said with tongue-in-cheek, "Why, of course not. We ought to leave it to the atheists. Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything to complain about. And we'd really rather complain than do something, wouldn't we?"
Classic. Well, summing up, Jesus is Lord of all, including politics. As we noted in an earlier session, different people are called to different things. We need to support those whom God has truly called to whatever mission field they feel called to and are well suited for. Whether that's in the political realm, the boardroom, in the arts, or the media, we need to support those active Christians who are striving to glorify God in humility and quiet strength in all sorts of places. We should support each other in Christ, always evaluating everything by the standard of His Word. And we should certainly vote in a well-informed and intelligent manner and in ways that reflect our biblical values. So we see that even the realm of the state, even the realm of politics, is under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Although I think many in Washington, D.C. might not realize it, they have their governing authority by the grace of Jesus Christ for His sovereign purposes. Be sure to take a moment, if you will, to go over the questions in the study guide. In our next installment, we'll be looking at the sphere of the school. Well, thanks for joining us today. May God bless you as you seek to apply the Lordship of Christ to every aspect of your life.
This has been a production of Truth in Action Ministries.